everyone. Thank you all for coming and being here in person despite the weather. I really appreciate it. I don't like talking to a computer, so it's much nicer to see your faces here and talk to you. And thanks also to Miguel for accepting my my ruse to bring you over. Okay, so what I'm going to be presenting here today is a paper that I developed with Sarah Hintze, who is an animal welfare scientist. So she's not a philosopher. She works hands-on with animals. She works with farmed animals on their well-being, their welfare. And we wrote this paper together, bringing together both of our expertise. So the context of my talk, the kinds of animals that I'm going to be talking about are animals used in intensive farming. So I am not going to be describing the conditions they are kept in any detail, since I'm going to assume that everyone is familiar with this, but in a very, very fast, we can say that these idyllic farms that are in the popular imagination are a myth. They don't exist in reality. Most of the animals that end up on our plates live their lives in overcrowded, unhygienic, and highly stressful conditions that cause them huge amounts of suffering and amount to a massive ethical problem. So I'm going to be talking about these kinds of animals, land animals who are farmed in industrial intensive farms. And I'm not going to be defending that these animals have sentience or emotions, given that the cognitive and emotional complexity of these kinds of animals has been well established. So I'm not going to go into that. Instead, I'm going to presuppose this cognitive and emotional complexity, and I'm going to be discussing the so-called disenhancement debate. This is what I'm going to be talking about. So what's the disenhancement debate? So in order to understand where this comes from, we can go to the birth of this very debate, which happened in the 1980s when a strain of blind chickens was accidentally produced, and the welfare of these blind chickens was compared to the welfare of sighted counterparts. And what they found was that the blind chickens seemed to have higher welfare than their sighted conspecifics. They moved around less and they interacted less with each other. And as a result, they were less prone to feather pecking and to cannibalism, which are two big problems in the intensive farming of chickens. And in addition to that, they showed higher productivity and they produced more and bigger eggs while consuming less feed. Now, the results of this original experiment have actually been brought into question, so it's not clear that they actually do have higher welfare, but that doesn't matter because the point is that this experiment was the birth of a bigger debate called the disenhancement debate, which emerged together with all these new technological possibilities of genetic modification that led to the appearance of a discussion on whether we should genetically alter farmed animals or disenhance them, as it's called, in order to ensure that they have a better life in the farms. So several ethicists, like the ones we see pictured here, have defended to various degrees the view that we should disenhance farmed animals in order to diminish or altogether eliminate their capacity to experience negative affective states such as pain, fear, or distress. So the idea is these conditions produce pain, fear, and distress in the animals. So let's disenhance the animals so that they don't feel these emotions. One of the leading defenders of this idea has been Adam Shriver. Shriver acknowledges that the ideal scenario would be a world where everyone were vegan, but he considers this to be a highly unrealistic goal, given that the consumption of animal products is on the rise throughout the world, and humans are unlikely to switch to an entirely plant-based diet in the midterm. So he considers that genetically altering farmed animals to eliminate or diminish their capacity to experience negative affective states is a promising solution to the problem of farmed animal welfare, insofar as he considers that it's better than the status quo. It would produce a situation that would be better than the status quo. So a situation in which animals are still farmed, but they do not suffer in the process or experience minimal or reduced suffering, is understood by him to be preferable to the current reality where they, of course, suffer immensely, right? So before I move on, it's worth highlighting the welfarist logic of this debate. So this debate is not centered around the question of whether we should farm animals at all. This is not what they are interested in addressing. Instead, they are considering the question of how can we make farming less ethically problematic. So traditionally proposed solutions to this issue have focused on modifying the environment. How can we make the environment better for the animals? How can we enrich it so that they have a better life? But of course, there's the alternative, which is modifying the animal. And this is what these proponents of disenhancement are doing. So Sarah and I, in this paper, we agree with the general claim that disenhancing farmed animals would result in a situation that is better than the status quo, insofar as there would be less suffering, of course. However, we believe that it's a mistake to defend disenhancement as a solution, as a good solution to farmed animal suffering. Why? Because in very rough terms, because disenhancing the animals entails adopting a defeatist attitude towards the conditions that they are kept in. So instead of trying to improve these conditions to fit the psychological needs of the animals, what we are doing is taking the conditions as a given and adapting the animals to the conditions. So impoverishing their mental lives in order to better suit their barren environments. Now, of course, one could argue that animals can never have a truly good life so long as they are being farmed, right? And that we should instead adopt for the complete abolition of this practice. Now, of course, I am in favor of the abolition of farming animals, so that is my preferred solution to the whole problem. But I'm going to be following the welfarist logic of this debate for the purposes of this argument. So I'm going to be assuming that I'm not talking about this higher question, but the second one. Okay, so the philosophers who have defended animal disenhancement, and especially Schreiber, they make an assumption that is prevalent throughout the whole disenhancement debate, which is the assumption that by taking away the capacity to experience suffering, we would be benefiting the animal. We would be doing something that's for the good of the animal. And this is because they tend to presuppose a hedonistic value theory. Their axiological framework is a hedonistic framework. So according to hedonism, there are only two things that are intrinsically good or intrinsically bad, which is pain is intrinsically bad, encompassing all negative affective states, and pleasure is intrinsically good, which encompasses all positive affective states. These are the only things that have value, according to them. So because they presuppose a hedonistic framework, for them, the problem of farming animals reduces to the problem of the suffering it creates. So if you eliminate the suffering, you eliminate the problem. In this, they are sort of following this Benthamian Jeremy Bentham and his famous dictum. The question is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? For them, the question is can they suffer? If they're suffering, let's eliminate the suffering. However, of course, hedonism is not the only value theory. In fact, in discussions on animal well-being, on human well-being, it's fairly unpopular value theory. And there are other ways of accounting for what's intrinsically good. So, for instance, preference satisfaction theory equates the good with whatever satisfies our preferences. So there are no objective goods, but it all depends on what we value. Perfectionism, such as the capabilities approach defended by Martha Nussbaum, defends that the good is whatever supports the development of one's nature. So whatever makes us an excellent example of the sort of being that we are. And lastly, there are objectivist theories that equate the good with a series of objective goods that are good for individuals to have in their lives, regardless of whether or not they value them themselves. And these are goods such as pleasure, love, knowledge, achievements, etc. So I'm going to be considering other values besides pleasure. So I'm going to be implicitly sort of acknowledging some form of objectivist theory. But I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on what could justify that. Because what I'm most interested in examining in this talk is the question of to what extent does this enhancement actually benefit the animals? Because this is like an assumption that is followed by every single person in the debate, that this enhancement actually benefits the animal. And then there are questions of whether or not we should do it anyway, but this assumption is not questioned by anyone. So here's where I want to go. So I'm going to be analyzing this question in 3 steps. First, I'm going to introduce a thought experiment, just so that we know the sort of disenhancement that I'm going to be discussing. And then I'm going to be discussing what is lost from a hedonistic perspective, and then what is lost from the perspective of other value theories. Okay. So beginning then with our thought experiment. When we think about animal disenhancement, we need to first of all bear in mind that there are different types of disenhancement. So different modifications that an animal can go through that would alter her welfare. So some interventions can be very localized and entirely physical. For instance, the Angus are a breed of cattle that have been genetically modified so that they do not develop horns. And this trait eliminates the needs for disbudding or the cutting off the horns. And since disbudding is a painful experience, it's improving welfare to a certain extent. But this enhancement can also target the mental states of animals more directly. For instance, some research projects have been successful in genetically modifying animals so that they do not experience chronic pain. And in theory, one could disenhance farmed animals so much that they no longer have any mental life at all, turning them into what's called animal microencephalic lumps. So living lumps of meat with no feelings, consciousness of behavior. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on the second type of interventions. This is because the first step is less ethically problematic, even though, of course, there are discussions on the importance of having horns for cattle and that sort of stuff. The third kind of intervention, I think, is probably not going to be economically viable insofar as there's a disgust factor involved here, and that probably makes it unlikely. But here in the middle ground is really where the ethical issue, the ethical dilemma lies. So we came up with a thought experiment. This was fun because Sarah is used to, that's Sarah, this is me. And Sarah is used to working with actual experiments, doing actual experiments, and she is usually very limited by what is actually feasible empirically. So this was very liberating for her to suddenly be able to, come up with whatever conditions we wanted for this thought experiment. So we are going to take as our case study a hypothetical scenario in which we have the technology to genetically modify farm animals in order to completely eliminate their capacity to experience negative affective states. So in theory, this form of disenhancement could, of course, be also aimed at just diminishing the intensity or the variety of affective states, but we want to focus on this more radical case in order to defend the claim that we want to defend, which is that negative affective states are actually crucial for living a good life. So we take as our point of departure this core affect model developed originally by Feldman Barrett and Russell, where affective states are placed on these 2 dimensions. So you've got valence, positive and negative, and arousal, higher and low. And so what our thought experiment entails genetically modifying farmed animals to eliminate all affective states that fall on the left-hand side. So everything that falls on the side of negative valence. So this entails eliminating pain, fear, anger, frustration, sadness, depression, boredom, grief, all affective states that feel negative. So this is Willa. She is our imaginary subject. This is a cow. She's a cow who was subjected to this disenhancement process, and so she cannot experience any negative affective states. She was modified at the embryonic stage. So this technology, we're assuming, doesn't get to pick which embryo actually gets conceived. So the animal is modified at the embryonic stage, which means that the non-identity problem is bracketed, right? We're not concerned with that. So the idea is this intervention is taking something away from Willa that she would otherwise have. Okay. So naturally, we don't have the technology to carry out this at the moment, but There are research projects invested in trying to create willas. So we think that this is the right moment for an ethical discussion of what this actually means. Okay, so what would willa lose? Let's first think of this in terms of hedonism. So in terms of pleasure and pain, what would this entail for willa? The very first question, whenever I bring this up for students in my classes, like they are usually very perplexed, especially when I've taught this to biologists, because they're like, well, how is willa even going to survive if she doesn't feel pain, right? We know that humans with congenital insensitivity to pain actually have it very difficult to survive because pain is very important in that regard. However, for the purposes of this argument, we're going to assume, following Schreiber, that pain is made up of two distinct dimensions. On the one hand, we have the sensory dimension, which informs us of the intensity, quality, and localization of pain. And on the other hand, we have the affective dimension, which constitutes the unpleasantness of pain. Schreiber argues that these two dimensions of pain, the sensory dimension and the affective dimension, actually correspond to different areas of the brain. And so in theory, we could fully isolate the affective dimension of willa's pain, eliminate the unpleasantness of pain while still retaining the capacity to process harmful stimuli as such, or retain the sensory dimension. So we are going to assume that this double aspect of pain allows us to preserve both nociception and learning in relation to harmful stimuli while eliminating the unpleasantness of pain. Now, of course, this assumption could actually be wrong. This might not be possible, but that would only work in our favor because that would just mean that willa would not be able to survive, right? So that's no problem for us. But we think that the assumption is warranted to a certain extent. At least it's conceptually possible that nociception and learning can happen without the subjective experience of the unpleasantness of pain, because we know this, for instance, in the case of insects. We know that they have nociception and we know that they can learn about harmful stimuli, but there's still a discussion on whether or not they are sentient. So it seems that conceptually, at least, they are separate. Schreiber, in fact, assumes that the affective dimension of pain is necessary for at least some forms of learning, but he considers this not to be a problem because he argues sows or veal calves spend most of their lives confined in small pens where they can't do much of anything that would injure or otherwise harm themselves. So he's like, since they can't really do much that would harm themselves, doesn't really matter that they can't learn about harmful stimuli. We think that this is a very problematic argument for three main reasons. Firstly, because learning about harmful stimuli doesn't just have the purpose of preventing one from injuring oneself, but can also improve your quality of life. For instance, if you've injured your arm, the fact that your arm hurts can prevent you from it can help you not move the arm and so make it heal better and ultimately improve your quality of life, right? Second of all, this idea that animals are confined to small pens or crates where they can't really do much to injure themselves is actually only refers to a small number of animals during a small part of their lives. But most farmed animals are kept in large groups where they are confronted with many challenges and they constantly have to learn about harmful stimuli because they are in these overcrowded, highly stressful conditions. And last of all, if we were to actually find a way of keeping willa in such a way that we would be eliminating all risk of injury, then ultimately this would also eliminate forms of pleasure because it would go against all kinds of enrichment efforts. She would have to be completely immobilized. And so this would not be a good life in any way, right? So I'm not really going to be talking much more about pain, but there's all kinds of problems in this assumption anyway. Then I'm also going to be bracketting issues concerning hunger and thirst. Firstly, because it's not clear whether they're affective states or not. If they're not affective states, then they're not affected by disenhancement, so it's not an issue. If they are affective states, then we can either suppose that pleasures provide sufficient motivation for the animal to eat and to drink, or the animal can be force-fed because the animal anyway won't care that she's being force-fed because she can't experience any negative affective states. So I'm also not going to be discussing hunger and thirst. Now, positive affective states. Our imaginary disenhancement only targets negative affective states. So in theory, positive affect, the Willis capacity to experience positive affective states is entirely preserved. However, we believe that there are some reasons to believe that it would be inevitable for the disenhancement process to affect Willis capacity to experience positive affective states. One of the reasons for thinking this has to do with what my colleague Sarah Hintze, well, my co-author rather, calls the waves of welfare framework. Here, welfare, as you can see, is plotted across time. And what this framework does is put forward the idea that variation and contrast matters for welfare. So in order to experience something positive, you also need to experience something negative from time to time. So if we disenhance animals, what we are doing is we're taking away this contrasting counterpart, and so the waves shrink in height and the full spectrum of positivity cannot be experienced. This is, of course, just a speculation because we're not really sure that this is actually how it works, but there's at least theoretical room for that to happen. There's also the idea that certain emotions, certain concrete emotions that are positive might actually need negative affective states to emerge. So here we think of the case of flow. What's flow? This you might be familiar with the term or maybe not, but it's the experience, the feeling that you have when you are completely absorbed in the performance of a skillful activity that you find intrinsically rewarding and that you're good at. So something like playing an instrument or dancing or bouldering, once you're actually really good at it, you can go into flow. So flow is located between the borders of two negative affective states, namely boredom and anxiety, which are the result of a mismatch between the skills that you possess and the challenges that you're confronted with. So when do you experience boredom? Whenever your skills are more sophisticated than the challenges you are experiencing in that moment. And when do you experience anxiety? Well, when the opposite happens, when the challenges feel too difficult for your skills. So flow is in the middle where you have some challenge. So flow is not just about being immersed in an activity because the activity needs to be challenging in some way. It needs to require a skill. So you need to have the right match between your skills and the difficulty of the task in order to achieve flow. But this means that you need to experience whatever it is you're doing as a challenge. So you need these borders of boredom and anxiety to find flow. So if the challenge that's ahead of you doesn't evoke any negative affective states, for instance, any frustration or fear when you are unsure whether your skills are good enough, it's not really going to be a challenge. And so in theory, it's not going to enable flow in that regard. Of course, you might be thinking, well, animals in the current farming conditions don't experience flow anyway because their lives are horrible, which is true. But this gives us, we think, a reason to change the conditions they're kept in to make this experience possible for them, rather than tinkering with their psychology and making them incapable of ever reaching flow. So we do think that there are some reasons, admittedly a bit speculative, but there are some reasons to think that Willis capacity to experience the full range of positive affective states will be affected by the absence of negative affective states. From a hedonistic perspective, her life would still count as good because there would still be a balance of, there would still be more positive affective states than negative ones. But the fact that we are affecting the range and maybe the intensity of the positive affective states also have some importance here. Okay, but the really interesting things I think come when we consider perspectives beyond hedonism. So what Willa might lose from the perspective of value theories that admit the existence of other goods. So for hedonism, things are very simple. Pain is bad, pleasure is good. There's no really, there's not much more to say from their perspective. And so for them, negative affective states are seen as simply bad, which is why it makes sense to suggest disenhancement as a solution to farmed animal suffering. However, like a first thing that we need to point out is that despite the fact that negative affective states feel bad, they are very often instrumentally good. And this is probably why they evolved, or maybe is one of the reasons why they evolved. So of course, we mentioned that without pain, it would be impossible for Willa to survive. And this is because it has important functions that have to do with protecting bodily integrity. And the same might be said of hunger and thirst if they are indeed negative affective states. But also this applies to other emotions. For instance, fear has a function of protecting an animal from potentially dangerous stimuli. Disgust protects her from pathogens. Anger protects her from being wronged by others. Boredom keeps her active and engaged in the environment. And we can also attribute functions to other states that we're not yet sure whether farmed animals possess. Jealousy, for instance, might have the function of preserving one's social status. Guilt might help to regulate social relationships, etc. But what about other intrinsic goods? So other axiological frameworks allow the existence of other forms of intrinsic goods besides pleasure. So here I'm going to be considering individuality, social relationships, care, political participation, and agency, meaning as other goods that have been proposed and that will be affected by the absence of negative affective states. So beginning with individuality, we can define this as the quality of being an individual that is distinct from others with a unique set of emotional and behavioral dispositions. Individuality has often been highlighted as something that is good, which is connected to the notion of selfhood, for instance, which for Donaldson and Kimlicka grounds the inviolability of humans and other animals. Martha Nussbaum has also argued that it's wrong to objectify others because it implies treating subjects who are unique as though they were interchangeable with one another. And individuality can also be seen as grounding the non-replaceability of subjects. So the fact that each of us are unique and no one can fill our specific space. So all of this seems to be something valuable. So in order to consider what disenhancement does to individuality, we can have a look at this chart. This is a chart from a QBA study, qualitative behavioral assessment. It doesn't really matter how QBA works. I'm just putting this here so just to show you a range of adjectives that a person in the study used to describe the behavioral expression of horses in different situations. So you see that there's a bunch of different adjectives, and these different adjectives have different kinds of affect connected with them. So if we take away everything that has negative affect connected to it, what we see is immediately there's a reduction in the number of words that can be used to describe the individual. So we believe that if we're disenhancing a population of animals, what's going to happen is that the animals are going to become more homogenized. So their individuality is going to be reduced. Why? Because our individuality is at least partially defined by our personalities. Personalities includes our disposition to feel certain emotions in certain circumstances. So for instance, Willa might be different from other cows in that she's scared of humans, grouchy when she's hungry, or easily bored. All of these things partially constitute her individuality. Now, if Willa were the only disenhanced cow in the world, this would make her quite unique, the same way that people with congenital insensitivity to pain are quite unique amongst humans. But we're assuming that this applies to a full population of animals. So what we're doing is making them less individuals. So this, of course, adds to the existing worry that we already have regarding the idea that farmers de-individualize their animals by assigning them, for instance, numbers instead of names. So one of the ways in which farming animals might involve treating them with more respect would be by honoring and accommodating their individuality rather than by further worsening it by making them more homogeneous and less individual. The second good that I want to consider are social relationships. So here I want to go back to a seminal moral philosophy book published by Robert Nozick, very, very famous book, where he came up with an experiment in order to illustrate the shortcomings of hedonism. In this experiment, you are offered the possibility of plugging into an experience machine where you could live out the rest of your life experiencing a non-stop flow of pleasurable experiences. Now, it's funny because when I point this out in classes nowadays, the younger students are super willing to plug into the experience machine. So there might be a generational difference here, but at least for like the older generations, we are generally reluctant to plug into the machine. And one of the reasons why is because a life in this machine would be missing real connections with others, which as the social mammals that we are, we highly value, and we tend to believe that they give meaning and richness to our lives. So indeed, we can find social relationships in the form of friendship or love in many objective values or many lists of objective goods. And when we think about farmed animals, they are social animals, and this is the reason why they can be kept in overcrowded conditions, even though they do suffer a lot because they are social animals. And so we can assume that social relationships also add value to their lives, provided that they are allowed to develop and be sustained adequately, which of course is usually not the case. Now, social relationships, as I said, they often appear in these lists of objective goods, but they are listed as a separate good from pleasure. They are listed as something distinct, and this is because we understand social relationships as not reducible to the pleasure that they give us. So we value our connections with others, even if sometimes navigating them is difficult, and even if on the whole, they don't give us a greater balance of pleasure over pain. This is because it's the connection itself that we value and not specifically the pleasure that it brings us. In fact, if we think of someone who only valued their friendships because of the pleasure that they bring them, this is not going to be a very good friend, right? This is not going to be a person who's going to stick around when the going gets tough. So it's the connection itself that we consider valuable. Now, of course, there's no room for real connection in current intensive farmings, but again, we see this as a reason to modify the environment and not the animal. So why would this enhancement affect this? So we can still imagine that Willow would be able to have social relationships. She can still have friends, but in the absence of negative affective states in her and her companions, these relationships would be condemned to superficiality. So the fact that she's unable to feel anything but positive affective states when she's around other cows and away from other cows means that all her relationships become interchangeable with one another, right? So she doesn't really matter who's around her because she's always going to feel okay. And we feel that something fundamental is lost here because the value that we see in connection comes from the fact that we're not willing to trade our friends for other people. We want our friends. And moreover, in the absence of negative affective states, certain manifestations of love and friendship that we believe are a crucial part of these goods can no longer happen. So we can think about the case of loyalty, reconciliation, and grief. Loyalty, reconciliation, and grief would have no place in this world. Loyalty can only exist against the backdrop of a potential grievance. If no cow can feel betrayed or disappointed by Willa, she cannot be loyal to them. Reconciliation, in turn, can only take place after there's been a moment of anger or resentment. And in the absence of negative affective states that ground the feeling of missing someone, there can be no grief upon their loss. So some proponents of disenhancement actually welcome this result. For instance, Schreiber says that it's actually really good that a disenhanced cow would not feel any pain upon the separation of her from her calf. But we believe that something crucial is lost here, that a motherly love that doesn't trigger any grief upon separation doesn't really deserve that label anymore. So you are depriving the animal of something crucial. Of course, it's not that we want the cat to suffer when her calf is separated from her, it's that we don't want the separation itself to happen. But we do want the animal to have space for genuine social relationships in all their complexity and richness. So the fact that disenhancement would doom animals to a life without these kinds of bonds is, we think, a strong reason to consider them an inadequate solution to their plight. Something similar can be said with regards to a specific subset of social relationships that I think is especially valuable, and is social relationships of care. So me and my colleagues, we have argued in these two papers that the ability to care for others is valuable both instrumentally due to the good that it brings to the world, but also intrinsically, since being a caring individual is a praiseworthy character trait. And we have argued in these papers that animals who have the capacity to care for others ought to have this capacity respected, and this capacity ought to be protected. So the animal should be allowed to have their capacity intact and to be able to express the capacity to care for others. Now, we know that we have some indications that farm animals are capable of caring for others. We know that they're capable of engaging in emotional contagion and consoling individuals who are under distress. And we have tons of studies evidencing caring behaviors such as consolation, helping, and so on in many taxa, including primates, canids, rodents, elephants, cetaceans, and corvids. So farmed animals, they're not studied that often because of pressures from the agricultural lobby, but there's every indication to think that they can also care for others of their species. And in addition, we have some indication that negative affective states have an important role to play in care behavior. This comes from studies on rodents. So for instance, in the study here above, rats who were treated with anxiolytics were found less likely to help a fellow rat in need. And rats who had undergone a negative treatment themselves were more likely to help others in need. So it seems that negative affect has a role to play in motivating care behavior. Another important good that would be affected by the disenhancement process is agency. So animal welfare scientists have argued that farmed animals should be given more scope for agency. Sorry about that. So for instance, pigs should be allowed to root. Here we can see a piglet rooting around, which they really like to do and engages their agency. Some farms have also incorporated puzzle boxes like these for the goats to, like a lot of animals, for instance, they don't like to freeload. They would rather, so we see a phenomenon called contra freeloading. So the idea that they prefer food that they have to work for rather than food that they get for free. Why? Because it engages their agency and they find that intrinsically rewarding. And indeed, there's a reason to consider it an intrinsic good, because one of the reasons why we don't want to plug into an experience machine is that everything that happens inside the experience machine is not really a result of our agency. It's not really achievements of ours, right? It's just things that happen passively to us, and we think that's something bad. So of course, agency is not going to be completely lost in the absence of negative affective states, but we do think that it will be diminished for two main reasons. The first one is that agency is sometimes triggered by negative affective states. For instance, boredom is a driver for action because it leads to a desire to engage with the environment. Fear and discomfort can also trigger our agency, and so on. So an animal who is entirely content all the time would have little reason to actually do anything because they're just fine. Why would you want to engage with anything if you're fine all the time? So I think we think that's going to affect their agency. And also the development of or the engagement of one's agency is often aimed at increasing one's competences. And if Willa is not going to be able to experience anything as a challenge, or am not going to receive any feedback required to refine her skills, because feedback required to refine your skills entails negative effect, then she won't experience challenges as such. She won't be motivated to develop her agency in any way. We think this is going to also affect her capacity to have a meaningful life. So Perks and Delon define meaning as that which emerges when an animal generates value with their behavior. So if they generate value, then there's meaning. That's a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy reference, if anyone got that. So of course, we need agency to be involved here, because we do not want to say that dairy cows were generating gustatory value through their contribution to dairy products have meaningful lives. In order not to have to conclude this, we need to have we need the connection to value to come through agency. So if you have less scope for agency, you're going to have less scope for meaning in your lives. And of course, farmed animals currently have few opportunities for pursuing and generating meaning, but we see this as a reason to expand their scope for agency rather than diminish it. The last intrinsic good that I want to briefly consider is political participation. I'm using this term following authors such as Donaldson and Kimlicka or Meyer, not to refer to farmed animals participating in our elections, but rather to their capacity to have a say in the sort of treatment that they are owed. So authors such as these have argued that the fact that farmed animals lack our language doesn't mean that they cannot voice their opinions and make their preferences known to us. In fact, they very often do, but we simply do not listen to them. And there are, of course, plenty of examples of farmed animals refusing to cooperate with humans, attacking them, or escaping farms or slaughterhouses. I just copied two screenshots from news websites. When farmed animals rebel in this sort of way, they are engaging politically. They are making a statement about the way they want to be treated. So political participation is, out of the different goods that I have considered, arguably the one that is currently available to a higher degree to farmed animals. Still, there are, of course, a lot of ways in which we prevent them from engaging politically, in that they have been bred for docility for millennia, and they're also very restricted in their freedom of movement. But if we disenhance Willa, we are making her completely docile and utterly complacent to our treatment of her. She would become incapable of experiencing anything as negative, and so incapable of protesting against any treatment and rebelling in any kind of way. And we feel that this is a highly problematic outcome. Of course, this is because we are ultimately thinking of the problem with farmed animals as a problem that comes from it being a system of oppression, rather than the problem coming from pain and suffering. So you're making the oppression worse by disenhancing the animal. We think that if we want farmed animals to have any chance at a good life, we should enhance their political participation in hopes of achieving a mutual relationship to which all parties can consent. Of course, we are skeptical that such an outcome is ultimately feasible, but any attempt at it should involve creating more space and giving them more scope to tell us how they feel, as well as by us listening to what they have to say. So if we disenhance the animals, we're taking their voices away, and this would, of course, go directly against this harm. So to conclude, we agree with authors such as Schreiber that disenhancement would improve farmed animals' current situation. It might even shift them from a life not worth living to a life that's barely worth living due to the immense reduction of suffering that would result from it. However, we also think that disenhancement would preclude animals from ever leading a good life. This is because it would not just affect their capacity to lead a good hedonistic life, but also because it would eliminate or severely diminish their possibility of accessing other intrinsic goods apart from pleasure. So we think that disenhancement is better than the status quo, but it is a defeatist solution. And we believe a truly unacceptable one if we care about the animals. So instead of improving their lives by making them poorer, we think we should do so by making them richer. So if we ought to farm animals, and of course this is a gigantic if, we should not adapt the animal to the current system, but rather adapt the system to the animal in order for her to live a life that is as good as possible. Now, of course, I haven't really spelled out how this might be done, but I have pointed out to certain things that need to be present in these animals' lives, such as ample possibilities for pleasure, individuality, sociality, care, agency, meaning, and political participation. And this requires preserving their capacity to experience negative affective states. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.